Hello, everyone. I know the music is really fun, but the rest of our event will be even more exciting. I have a small request before we begin proceedings. We deliberately chose not to make this a webinar so we could see all your lovely faces. And I know you are in different array of morning, afternoon, evening, but show us your beautiful faces so that Gowri can feel the love. We will mute you for a bit, but seeing everyone is going to be, we're all exhausted, but there is a moment of celebration today, which I will be speaking about anon. So without further ado, let me begin. My name is Anjali Arundekar, and I, along with Darja Newman and my auntie Fernando, are the co-directors of the Center for South Asian Studies at the University of Santa Cruz. Jai Bhim, and a big warm welcome to the second event of our Fall 2021 series on Dissent. It is a 3-year initiative in terms of programming. Our first year was focused on justice. This year is focused on dissent. And the next year will be focused on sustainability. I also want to give a big shout out to my bagman, to use a good colonial term, Nelson Hutchinson, for keeping everything going. He will be putting the information about the music, because the music is as important to our bear tug as everything else. So I know people who are rocking in their chairs will be able to follow the music as we go along. But before I begin introducing Gowri and saying a little bit about our center, if you could just bear with me, I want to acknowledge that the land on which UCSC stands is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking UP tribe. The Amamatsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people, is today working hard to resolve and address the historical trauma and restore traditional stewardship practices. Now, I also want to remind us that such traditional acknowledgements are not the same as a relationship. As my dear friend, the Indigenous queer scholar Joseph Pierce reminds us, land does not require that you confirm it exists or that it has been stolen, rather that you reciprocate the care that it has given you. Now, the Center for South Asian Studies here, as many of you know, is a newly established research unit. We are just in our second year, and we are focused explicitly on justice, broadly defined aesthetic, feminist, economic, environmental, social, and so much more within South Asia and the broader Indian Ocean world. We have worked over the past 2 years very hard to curate conversations that both foreground and challenge continued histories of occupation, authoritarianism, as we continue to see every day in Indian occupied Kashmir, and the foundational disposability of minoritized bodies, as we have seen in most virulent forms in the brutalities in Tripura, marked by caste, religion, gender, region, and of course, labor segmentation. At the heart of our struggles remains the enduring question of the subaltern life worlds within which our collectivities survive, resist, refuse, and sometimes surrender. Now, today marks the second event, as I said, of our year-long series on dissent. We thank every one of you for returning and for your extraordinary support in making our tiny center come alive, and for allowing us to carve out collectivities across Zoom oceans to educate, organize, and agitate. Now, for a change, it is wonderful today to celebrate the energizing news coming out of India in the past 24 hours, as most of you here know, around the repeal of the 3 anti-farmer pro-corporate laws. To echo the words of the Samyukt Kisan Morcha, even as this repeal marks a historical victory for the people's power of dissent, we must equally pause and memorialize the 750 farmers who lost their lives during the 1.5-year long and ongoing struggle. Let us leave today for a change our collective exhaustion and even cynicism aside and embrace this brief moment of collective joy. Let us remember also the smaller but equally strident victories of Deepa Mohanan, a Dalit PhD scholar and scientist at the Mahatma Gandhi University at Kottayam, Kerala, who a few weeks ago embarked on a 10-day hunger strike to protest institutional caste and gender discrimination, and miraculously succeeded in transforming and reversing university policies. These are our scenes of dissent. Now, as such, I am delighted that we have with us today Professor Gowri Vijayakumar, whose timely research deftly brings together tense and tender vocabularies of dissent and coalition across histories of global health, pandemics, and sexuality. Gowri is an assistant professor. Why are you not associate? You certainly should be, but anyway, Gowri is an assistant professor of sociology and women's gender and sexuality studies at Brandeis University. I have had the pleasure of knowing and learning from Gowri on multiple academic and activist stages. And in each encounter, I have been struck by the generosity, acuity, and capaciousness of her thinking and engagement. Her wonderful recent book, Run Out and Buy It, Celebrate Diwali Late or Celebrate Christmas Early, She Needs the Money. Her wonderful recent book, At Risk, Indian Sexual Politics and the Global Indian Crisis, just out from Stanford University Press, is indicative of such attentive and absorbing histories in the making as she charts genealogies of resistance, coalition, and survival of minoritized communities at risk within ongoing long durays of the AIDS crisis. She specifically thinks about sex workers and men who have sex with men. And in doing so, she considers how moments of potential precarity can also lend themselves to movements of dissent and possibility. Her talk today will draw from the book and her ongoing research on risk, respectability, and sexuality. So please welcome me in extending a very, very warm welcome to Gowri. Now, before I turn it over to her, I wanted to just go over a few Zoom protocols. As I said, we have tried to create an ambiance, a baitak, a mehfil, so please show yourselves if you feel up to it so that we can see all your faces. We have muted you for the duration of Gowri's talk. If only we could do that with so many other people in the Indian state, but alas, my powers are limited. And once Gowri is done with her talk, we will of course unmute everybody and you will have a chance to ask your question yourself. If you'd like to ask a question, please message me privately and I'll put you in a queue and I will call on you and when your turn arrives. Okay, without further ado, let me turn it over to Gowri.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Anjali, for that amazing introduction. I'm so honored to be part of this series. And actually, I was thinking that I think the first time I met Anjali and when I first spoke at Santa Cruz was when I was a graduate student at the South Asia by the Bay Conference in 2014. It was like the first time I ever presented anything from this project, and I was still kind of in the middle of fieldwork at that time. And I think I'm still just as much in awe to be speaking now with you all as I was then, but hopefully things have developed a little bit since then. In the spirit of land acknowledgements and the holiday that's coming up, I'm gonna just share a link for a project run by the Wampanoag tribe, whose lands aren't far from where I am now, and who've been fighting for their tribal sovereignty rights and for their status. So this is just a link to one project in case you're interested. So I'm gonna now share my screen. Is this working?
We're all good, Gowri.
All right. So as Anjali said, I'm going to talk about my book, which just came out, but with a focus on kind of the aspects of the book that speak to the theme of the lecture series, so to Dissent. And I'm going to try to do something I don't typically do, which is kind of speak to the whole arc of the book, but with this particular theme in mind. So I hope you'll bear with me because I'm not going to be able to kind of pull together all of the argumentative threads of the book. But anything that's not so clearly articulated here is more fully developed in my book. So this is kind of my disclaimer and my advertisement. As I began to make my way from a sex worker health clinic in Nairobi to the nearby Matatu stop, a woman in the waiting area asked very politely if she could have a word with me. Grace was small and thin, with a jagged scar across her mouth. Tentatively but insistently, she told me she was a sex worker and had previously worked at the clinic as an HIV peer educator. Then she had been arrested while doing sex work. When she was finally released from jail, she found herself destitute. She said she had 3 children. The youngest was only 7 months old. She might be dressed well, she said, but she had nothing. She asked me if I could find her a spot in the next peer educator training session. She rifled through her handbag until she found a crumpled business card to show me. I was surprised to see the familiar logo of a sex workers' rights and HIV organization based in Karnataka, Activism. This is the image on the card. So this is
Gowri,
the story.
sorry to interrupt,
Yeah.
but your screen is a little cut, so people have been messaging the
Oh,
left side.
is that
If
better?
you can, yeah, perfect. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. This is
Okay,
perfect.
great.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. So can you all see this picture? Okay. I think this story kind of speaks to many of the questions I want to raise in this talk. So aside from this kind of odd little stab of Kannadiga recognition and nostalgia it inadvertently evoked in me, I had just finished doing kind of most of my fieldwork had been done in Karnataka, and then I had just come to Nairobi for a shorter period of fieldwork. The request was odd. The clinic where Grace had come for services was run by one of the oldest organizations working with sex workers in Kenya on HIV and sexually transmitted infections. It had been there for 30 years, 20 years longer than Ashodaya Samiti, and it was well established in the neighborhood. So why then was an ostensibly random, slightly sweaty Indian woman walking down the hallway the person Grace thought could help her fulfill her aspirations? What I think this encounter shows us is that the HIV clinic offered a particular kind of salvation for Grace. Not an HIV test, not free AIDS medication, not even a women's empowerment training, but a job. The HIV prevention establishment offered her potential for financial security and upward mobility that being a sex worker, because it was criminalized and unpredictable, couldn't necessarily promise. AIDS itself was incidental to this institutional reality for her. Note too, her insistence on an appropriate form of supplicant femininity. She was the mother of 3 children, and she insisted that her neat clothes were not a sign of her self-indulgence or wealth. She still needed help. So this was a claim to sexual respectability pitched within an imaginary of India, and specifically India's HIV effort as a site of possibility, a possibility that my presence as a middle-class Indian woman in the clinic represented. To put this moment in context, we need to understand how India's AIDS response had come to be understood within transnational networks of global health expertise at this time. So in the early 1990s, experts were sure that India would be the next epicenter of the AIDS epidemic. So these are headlines from the New York Times between 1987 and 1996. North American AIDS experts painted India as a sexually backward country sitting on an epidemiological time bomb. And you can kind of see a tone of accusation to this international coverage. By the mid-1990s, Indian and North American AIDS experts agreed that India faced the biggest AIDS epidemic in the world, with 3 million people HIV positive and estimates ranging from 5 to 50 million people by the 2000s. And of course, later these estimates were drastically revised down to 2.4 million by 2007. But during this time of kind of impending crisis, massive global financial resources were infused into the Indian AIDS response from donors like the World Bank, the Global Fund, DFID, and the Gates Foundation. So just to give you a sense, this chart represents overseas development aid to India from the late 1990s through 2018. And you can see from the places where the green line kind of exceeds the gray line that in these moments, these were kind of the beginning of each national AIDS program phase. Commitments to AIDS outpaced the entire rest of the health sector. The budget for the National AIDS Control Program's third phase, which started in 2007, was $2.5 billion. And to just put this in context a little bit, in the early 2000s, 120,000 adults in India were documented as dying of malaria, 100,000 of AIDS-related causes, so around the same number. But in 2006, donors dispersed $19 million for malaria control and $108 million for AIDS, so some 5 times the amount. This is the AIDS exceptionalism that scholars like Adia Benton have talked about. But by the time I was conducting fieldwork, the sense of India's impending crisis had been displaced by a different story, and this was one of India's success. This is an Indian Express article from 2015. It notes that India was no longer the next sub-Saharan Africa with its vast swaths of densely populated unhygienic living quarters, crippling poverty and malnutrition, and that India can look back with can afford to look back with some satisfaction. So you can see here how sub-Saharan Africa plays the role of kind of a dangerous alternative pathway against which India's rise as a world power can be charted. This is from an interview I did with a high-ranking official at the National AIDS Control Organization, who had later gone on to work in international AIDS governance through UNAIDS. And he told a similar story. So he called AIDS in India a silver lining in the dark cloud we have in this country. When we have so many failures, at least something we can show as a success. This was the India Grace hinted at when she asked me for a job. By the time I was doing fieldwork, delegations from African countries were getting funding to travel to India to learn about India's AIDS response, and efforts to translate the learnings of Indian HIV prevention were underway in Kenya and elsewhere. So most of my fieldwork actually focused on kind of this attempt to translate an Indian HIV prevention project to Nairobi and Mombasa. So Indian sex workers were key to this success story. A slew of case studies, academic articles, and media reports celebrated India's sex workers at the forefront of India's AIDS response. Cisgender women sex workers in particular, and slightly later kotis, hijras, transgender people, and other men who have sex with men and gender non-conforming people, and in a conditional and kind of precarious way, IV drug users, were incorporated into the state's HIV prevention effort. But initially, kind of the main imaginative focus was on sex workers. And they were the main focus of sort of the advertising of the Gates Foundation as well. So Bill Gates, whose $338 million Avahan program occupied outsized media attention about India's AIDS response, was said to have struggled to hold back tears when he met a sex worker who told him about her daughter who had committed suicide because of stigma against sex workers. And by the way, all these photos I'm showing you are publicly available if they have people in them. I did not meet Bill Gates, though I did meet some of the other people in this picture and visit this office. I spent time in this office where this picture is taken. So the activism of sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people in the context of HIV, though, extended beyond Bill Gates' monitoring and evaluation systems. AIDS also became a major platform for organizing broader claims on the state. For example, the largest union of sex workers in India, Durbar, or DMSC, began as an HIV prevention initiative. So what does this massive global institutional response mean for the sex workers and sexual and gender minorities who were categorized as at risk of HIV? An image like this has provoked a couple of different kinds of responses from scholars and activists. One response, and I think this is particularly true of activists and scholars focused on sex work who've kind of mainly focused on cisgender women who do sex work, is that AIDS interventions, for all their pitfalls and contradictions, offered a political opportunity. So I'm thinking of a scholar like Prabha Koteshwaran or Chaitanya Lakimshetty's article, HIV is Our Friend, which is also part of our book, have advanced this view. So it was a platform for activism and opening within the state, and HIV became a counterweight to the powerful global anti-trafficking organizations and lobbyists who pushed for the further criminalization of sex work. Another response, and particularly come from queer critics and scholars, Akshay Khanna, Aniruddha Datta, and others, who've argued that the AIDS industry was a force of surveillance, the expansion of biotechnology into intimate life, and contributed to the narrowing of sexual imaginations into epidemiological categories that counter the potential for kind of radical imaginings of sexuality. So I want to draw inspiration from both of these kind of lineages in my attempt to make sense of dissent in this context. So the crisis moment of HIV presented both a political opportunity and a disciplining of sexual life. And I think many of these scholars have kind of pointed to this complexity. So what I want to kind of work with here is to make the point that there wasn't a pure space of dissent outside of the state for these sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people who were working within the terrain of HIV prevention programs. There was no kind of authentic sexual essence subject to the force of the state coming from outside, nor was this kind of a strategic group of activists kind of targeting the state and learning how to leverage its opportunities. Activist incomes were paid by global health donors. State aid society banners had to be taken down and replaced with a protest banner before activist work could begin. The protest pictured here, which I attended in 2012 in the Sonagachi red light district in Kolkata, took place in the midst of meetings as part of the International AIDS Conference and was attended by sex worker activists from all over India, Asia, Europe, and Africa, as well as people from UNFPA, UNAIDS, and Amnesty International, local politicians looking for sex worker vote banks, and people hoping to find a hookup. I don't want to suggest that what looks like dissent is really compliance, or that what looks like compliance is really dissent, but rather that dissent must be fought on the terrain of the state and global institutions. And this means that activists had no choice but to engage both collectively and individually with the call for respectable sexuality that sat at the core of tensions about India's AIDS crisis. So HIV prevention programs presented spaces in which those deviant forms of sexuality and gender that posed a risk to the nation were reformulated as central to the nation's success on the world stage. In the process, the strategies and tactics for dissent took shape in ways that exceeded the logic of national sexual morality and of neoliberal global health, but it was always kind of within the limits of this terrain. So in placing these moments of dissent within a larger context of Indian engagements in Kenya, I also hope to decenter the fixed set of targets that we typically understand to be the object of mobilization. So, the patriarchal and heteronormative state or Western biomedical institutions and kind of the alliance between them. Instead, I want to show that key to India's AIDS response is a claim to modernity within a shifting global field, a form of modernity that is inextricably linked to a claim of respectable sexuality and its particular characteristics, that it's both kind of open and restrained, both modern and traditional, and that this claim takes shape not only in contrast to the West, but also in relation to Africa, manifest in both concrete and imagined ways. So as Cindy Patton writes, global imaginaries of AIDS can be mapped directly onto pre-existing national and cultural formations. And the idea of Africa is central to those. And I'm also inspired here by Antoinette Burton's work on imaginations of Africa and their role in supporting ideas of Indian nationhood and modernity. So what I'll do in the rest of this talk is examine 3 different arenas in which dissent took shape to show you how these battles over risk and respectability played out. One in the formal arena of social movement action in the early era of the AIDS response, one in kind of the everyday negotiations of HIV prevention workers at NGOs and CBOs, and one in the personal negotiations of peer educators and at-risk people. And this part of the talk is mainly going to focus on the bulk of my fieldwork, which happened in Bangalore. So a lot of this is also specific to kind of political formations in Bangalore. So if people want to talk more about this, I'd be happy to do that. So starting with its early arrival in India, the specter of AIDS was animated by symbolic geographies. One key reference point was the West. This was a binary between Western sexual degeneracy, permissiveness, and material excess, in contrast to India's moral virtue. We see this in the public health campaigns of the time. So just a couple of images. These actually aren't from Bangalore, but I think they capture kind of the national public health efforts of this time. So you can see how they emphasize a kind of monogamous heterosexual home against the dangers of sex outside. What's implied here is that this man, here's another image, is going to go to the city and have sex with a sex worker. What's less directly addressed in this public health education campaign is the specter of homosexuality. But the newspaper articles and medical journal articles I analyzed from this time period were actually preoccupied with homosexuality. So there was this ongoing debate about whether India's HIV epidemic was even a problem when it was really a Western disease that resulted from Western vices like homosexuality. So just as an example of that discourse, an Indian expert told the press that Indian values would ward off AIDS and gave the example that the homosexuality percentage in India was 5 to 15% homosexuals compared to 40 to 60% in the US. So if you look at the medical literature on AIDS in India in the 1980s, and especially the 1990s, these discussions about homosexuality kind of feed in to a discussion about whether the epidemic in India is really a problem or not, and then related to that, whether it looks similar to the African epidemic or the Western one. So medical expertise ultimately settled on the idea that India had a heterosexual epidemic instead of a homosexual epidemic. And the idea of Africa was key to this. So essentially, India was more like Africa than the West. So you can see this kind of temporal geography playing out here, and this kind of idea of AIDS moving across the world, first from gay communities in San Francisco through to entire populations in sub-Saharan Africa, and then kind of coming to the Asia Pacific region. So this meant that after the first case of AIDS was identified in India in 1986, the state started to crack down in particular on two groups, sex workers and Africans, or more euphemistically in the medical literature, a pool of infected women and foreign students. After an African student was found to be HIV positive, the Indian Ministry of Health announced in October 1986 that AIDS testing was compulsory for all foreign students seeking admission to Indian universities. And by 1987, 11 African students had been deported. These repressive measures were immediately met with protest. So African students protested the guidelines by boycotting the test. And in February 1987, African students organized a protest march in Delhi, arguing that the testing constituted medical apartheid. And just an aside, I think it's notable that this was one of the kind of first moments of organized protests in relation to the AIDS epidemic, and it was led by African migrants to India and framed specifically explicitly in the context of global racialization. So in 1988, activists in Chennai, led by Shamla Nataraj, went to court to challenge the detention of 5 HIV positive sex workers who were among the first to test positive for AIDS in India. In 1990, over 900 women who had been brought to Madras from Mumbai on a train called the Mukti Express, which the press reported as a symbol of freedom, and the sex workers were chugging toward their yearning for destination and liberation, to be tested for AIDS. So once they were brought there, they were left with limited food and access to medical care, and they were cut off from their families. There were women who died in this period of confinement. So Nataraj's legal challenge and the challenge of the sex worker she was working with, who eventually became the organization CIAP, resulted in the release of over 800 detained women in the state of Tamil Nadu. So I also want to note that this AIDS activism in the early 1990s worked across constituencies. So for example, the Citizens Report by the AIDS Bedbhav Virodi Andolan published in 1990 included accounts of the detention of Dominic D'Souza in Goa, the death of a sex worker while in confinement in Madras, and doctors' refusal to treat an African diplomat who died of AIDS in Delhi. Less Than Gay, which was published the following year, was an expansive account of gay life in India. And ABVA pushed for the stalling of the AIDS prevention bill successfully in 1989. And they also filed a writ petition in 1994 to strike down Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. And this would lay the foundation, of course, for the Naz Foundation's challenge in 2001. So here's just another example of some of the AIDS activism of the time. This is from 1994, an effigy of a dinosaur representing AIDS, burned by the Indian Health Organization in Bombay, and kind of just pointing out the fact that ideas of modernity were really key to kind of AIDS activism as well, even in this time. So by the mid-1990s, there were several organizations working specifically with cisgender women in sex work who were part of the AIDS response, like DMSC in Kolkata, VAMP in Sangli, CIAP in Chennai, and Samraksha in Bangalore. And these organizations presented a direct challenge to the repressive tactics of the state in the early years of the epidemic. For example, in the Sex Workers Manifesto written in 1997, activists argued that HIV prevention reduced sex workers to their sexual behavior and argued that they should be viewed as complete persons with a range of emotional and material needs, living within a concrete and specific social, political, and ideological context, which determined the quality of our lives and our health. This next image is from a protest in 2006 in Karnataka by the Karnataka Sex Workers Union, when the government proposed changes to the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act in 2006 that would further criminal restrictions on sex work. So aside from this challenge to national policy, there were many, many struggles that played out locally in the context of HIV prevention. So protests of abusive doctors, of police departments, of media, of the AIDS establishment, including NGOs with bad labor practices and state agencies. So these organizations were kind of working across national, international, and local arenas in this activism in this period. So I'm taking you through this to chart a trajectory of activism that challenged, critiqued, and spilled out from the state's AIDS response that initially took a repressive and violent approach to the groups who were designated at risk. But this last protest is kind of different from the previous ones I showed you, because increasingly by the mid-2000s, this activism wasn't directly in opposition to the state's AIDS response, or at least it was working with a fragmented state by this point. So by the mid-2000s, the National AIDS Control Organization itself was submitting affidavits in the Supreme Court in support of sex worker and sexual minority activism, specifically in these cases around the ITPA and Section 377. At the same time, the state began to incorporate activist community-based organizations and NGOs into its peer education efforts. So why was this incorporation happening? So this was really a response to a practical reality. Preventing the spread of HIV required the state to reach groups that were criminalized and precarious. And I've interviewed many state officials who said that they simply didn't know how to recognize a sex worker or a man who has sex with men to follow the categories of the HIV response when walking down the street. And so a lot of them described this kind of similar story of walking down the street with an activist for the first time and having people point out where the people at risk of HIV were, where the risks of HIV were. So the impending AIDS crisis, and you can see here in this NACO report that the state increasingly recognized this, would require moving outside the traditional government machinery. It would require actually engaging with and incorporating activists into its programs as peer educators, outreach workers, program managers, and even sometimes into official consultations and policy decision-making. And this meant, and when I say activists here, I mean kind of organized groups of activists, but also kind of local leaders, right? So in this period, state AIDS officials would try to find out, who was the most powerful sex worker in one block and who had the kind of biggest following, and then reach out to that person as guiding their HIV prevention effort, because they knew that they had kind of leadership and trust in that particular place. So in the big picture, this moment marks a suspension of the typical sexual moralities of the state, a kind of moving outside of business as usual, which was built into the logic of crisis. So in this conditional moment of the AIDS crisis, these kind of sexual moralities could be suspended. So In the second part of this talk, I want to discuss the twists and turns activists had to take once they became more closely imbricated with state HIV prevention programs in the 2000s. So what did this closer relationship mean for the forms that Dissent could take? So I arrived a bit after noon to a training event for brothel madams on the terrace of an old house in North Bangalore. A few of us sipped mango juice and chatted while we waited for others to arrive. The attendees arrived together and settled into rows of chairs in front of a small podium decorated with a brightly colored awning. After a quick icebreaker, a role play about a tiger in the forest who learns he needs the other animals to help him, a young man from another organization began a lecture about the causes and prevention of HIV. Who knows how to use a condom, he asked with a didactic flair. Everyone raised their hand. We're all people who know it already, sir, someone called out. Let's talk about how to do it anyway, he said. Sometimes people don't really know how to do it, even if they say they do. So one at a time, he called on 4 volunteers from the audience. Each one executed a flawless demonstration of how to put a condom on a standard issue, bright red model of a penis and sat back down. Nevertheless, the man gave an additional demonstration himself just because he knew that's what he was there to do. He sat on a chair with the model carefully positioned between his knees and stretched the condom over the penis. I heard some suppressed laughter. Over lunch, the peer educators complained about the training. I've heard it a million times, the same story, one said. But this is what the project is, said someone else. You can't go outside of that. After lunch, we gathered for a presentation about the law, this time by a representative from the Karnataka State AIDS Prevention Society, or CSAS, with tight jeans and a gruff tone. Now, you know what the law is. You're not supposed to send people. He was referring to the ITPA, under which sexual exchange is technically legal, but profiting off the earnings of another sex worker is not. So you have to agree to the law, don't you, he said. A tall woman in a bright green sari called out, well, the law doesn't agree to us either. The presenter continued, ignoring her. Now, is the law going to change? No. If you wanted to change it, you'd have to start a sangha for that and protest. He moved into an explanation of which aspects of sex work were criminalized and which were not. It's fine for you to do sex work, he said, just not to cause trouble to society. Now, what do you do if police come? Well, there are ways to get around the law. Then he paused. I'm not supposed to tell you, but look, if you are in a sangha, there's a crisis management team. If you call them, a group of people can come and stop it. If you go to the police station alone, they will beat you. If 20 women come, you can beat them. So there are a couple of things I want to point out in this moment. One is the relative ineffectiveness of the state representatives who are ostensibly there to educate brothel madams about the use of condoms and the rules of appropriate sex work within the law. The sex workers who were watching mocked his attempts to teach them about appropriate sexuality, and they knew that the law wasn't really there to protect them. In response, he offered them a contradictory vision of the state. Laws around sex work could not change, but within the unusual conditions of HIV prevention, he encouraged them to take the law into their own hands. As part of meeting their responsibility to prevent HIV and protect the nation, he was asking these sex workers to fight the state. It's worth noting, too, how the response of the peer educators to the bureaucrat was largely one of dismissal and even disdain. The banner was up, the program was happening, but the main purpose of the event was to talk and get a free meal, to laugh in the back room, and then get back to ordinary life. Within CBOs, too, these power dynamics of organizations played out on a day-to-day basis. Struggles over control of programs were constant. So once I attended a meeting facilitated by 2 young men who were kind of NGO program managers who were standing at a chalkboard while about 36 sex workers, mostly cisgender women and a few kotis, were sitting on the ground and a few in chairs. So both men were writing on the board as they spoke, and the topic of the discussion was an upcoming public program the CBO was expected to hold under the state guidelines. So the women sat silently as one of the facilitators wrote the proposed date of the program on the board. Now we have to decide what we're going to do, he said. Few people spoke. Conversation picked up when both facilitators briefly stepped out of the room. While they were gone, one woman turned to the others. Don't agree to all that, she said, keep your mouth shut. When the facilitator came back, everyone started talking about some target numbers for condom distribution. One woman seated in a chair started cataloging in a continuous monologue the demands on peer educators. The facilitator was dissatisfied with her performance. When you send the report late, I'm the one who sits here till 8 doing the monthly report, he said. But you give all these targets, she said. Look, I've come here so that good can be done to the community. I'm also here to do good for the community, he replied impatiently. The argument continued for several minutes. Soon, another heated exchange emerged, now with a different peer educator complaining about the low pay at the job. Did I say I'll work here 8 hours a day? She said. The NGO staff at the meeting were attempting to assert control, standing at the board, writing numbers and targets, pointing to graphs. But the women, though sitting on the floor and ostensibly subject to dismissal by the staff at any time, used their own strategies to maintain control over the meeting, talking the facilitators down, arguing over minor and major issues, or even refusing to speak. It was a boisterous, tense, and electric environment. And ultimately, no discussion about the upcoming program took place. By arguing throughout the meeting, the women deflected the task they sought to avoid, stated their disagreements with the structure of the peer education program, and subtly reminded the NGO facilitators that the program would only function if they kept coming to work, kept bringing in new sex workers, and kept getting HIV tests themselves. So I offered this example as a way of pointing to ways sex workers who had been conscripted into the state AIDS response challenged the conditional terms on which they had been incorporated. I also want to emphasize that this wasn't solely a kind of weapons of the weak, foot dragging on the job form of dissent, because soon after, I would attend a public protest of peer educators in HIV programs objecting to these same exploitative working conditions and low pay that the women in the meeting had been informally protesting. And part of the aim of that protest was actually to make the claim that peer educators in HIV programs are not volunteers who should be paid a stipend, but actual government employees who deserve benefits and full-time salaries. I also want to point out that HIV drop-in centers were sites of experimentation in which forms of community and solidarity could take shape. The drop-in center was a central part of HIV prevention programs for many of the people I interviewed. They served a purpose in allowing cisgender women sex workers, working class transgender women and men and men who have sex with men to gather privately away from public spaces that could often be sites of violence and harassment. So if you walked up the stairs to one of the CBO offices I often visited, you would be first greeted by a pile of shoes. The TV would be on, sometimes inspiring an impromptu dance party. Once they crossed the threshold of the office, people moved their bodies more fluidly. The boundaries between bodies seemed less rigid. People snuggled or played with each other's hair, rested their heads on one another's laps or shoulders, and joked or argued for hours on end. If you came in the late morning or the early afternoon, the air in the office filled with the fragrance of tea. Nearing 6, people would start getting ready to leave, crowding around the mirror near the door as they applied a new coat of powder or lipstick before going together to pick up clients. Most CBOs where I spent time had piles of the ubiquitous cardboard boxes of Nirod condoms crammed against unoccupied segments of wall. Many also had spaces with Hindu idols for small pujas or rituals. It's like your mother's house, people would often tell me. People would celebrate their daughter's first periods or weddings or the birth of their children together in the office. In this way, the drop-in center could be a place to make a claim on respectability when these opportunities weren't available through institutions like the family. In some cases, people use the office to conduct sex work indoors, away from the threat of police harassment, and from a safe and private location, sex workers could negotiate with clients kind of in more detail, share clients with one another, laugh over unexpected requests, and compare notes about rates and services. An office meant another space to confer over clothes and makeup and jewelry. Sometimes people brought clothes they'd bought to discuss prices and quality. And in the book, I talk about how these articulations kind of varied among different types of organizations, right? So some organizations sort of had more of an investment in sort of reclaiming respectability within their organizational spaces, and some didn't. But this sense of kind of solidarity and shared connection in these spaces, I noticed in all of the offices I went to. So I've talked about how so-called at-risk groups challenge the HIV establishment at the level of collective action, and now through everyday contestations of state expertise, as well as through building communities of care within HIV drop-in centers. So the last thing I'll talk about is individual navigations of this landscape of state agencies, NGOs, CBOs, and activism, and the demands it placed on personal sexual identity and practice. Preeti identified as a transgender woman. She had done sex work when she lived in the Hijra community after migrating to Bangalore from Shimoga. This is a picture I took from the back of her scooter on the way to her house. She had later left her Hijra family to live separately when she found a partner who paid for her rent. But when she and the partner broke up, Preeti fell into a deep depression. At that point, she started working in HIV prevention. She told me how she had changed once she started working in HIV prevention. So this is what she said. Before, I used to spend a lot on clothing. I'd buy the cloth in the morning, get it stitched in the afternoon, and wear that outfit and go out that evening. The neck would be this deep, and I'd pull the veil up like this. Back then, that was my only job. Sex work was my only way of earning. But now I don't make the neck deep. I go and sit at the bar, I start drinking, and they come to me on their own. I say I work in an HIV prevention NGO, and if they're interested, they say, come with me, madam, and I have a lodge I usually go to, so I take them there. That Preeti mentioned HIV prevention work when soliciting clients might seem unexpected, but not in the context of the changes she felt that her HIV work had elicited in her. Preeti was no longer only a sex worker. She now worked at an office. You can see here that this had two implications. One was that she had a diversified income, and so she needed to do less sex work, but it also had the implication that Preeti had adopted a kind of new respectable embodiment. This wasn't an embodiment she always adopted, so she exceeded this embodiment in a variety of ways and in different kinds of spaces, but HIV prevention had given her an occasion to move through the world differently. Pallavi, a cisgender woman sex worker, echoed Preeti in describing how she learned to manage her voice. She says, I got courage from attending the meetings here. I learned how to talk to different kinds of people and the way to approach different kinds of people in different situations. We are rural people, and earlier I would speak crudely. In Bangalore, one should talk neatly, prettily, and with discipline. The words that come out of my mouth should not hurt anybody. I have been shouted at a lot in this office. They used to say that I hadn't learned anything, even after so many years, and that I talk strangely. Now I have become perfect. I can go to any person and talk to him without fear. They praise me now. Pallavi's account captures a balance of discipline and boldness, respectability and openness that centrally shaped her new sexual identity. She had been taught to talk neatly, and this new skill allowed her to talk to anyone without fear. She had learned the discipline, and this is also a word Preeti used, so shistu in Kannada, to navigate public space, the right forms of behavior that allowed her to blend in, and thus the basis to speak up when she needed. In both Pallavi and Preeti's cases, it's this very disciplining of sexuality that allowed for their navigation of public space and their ability to make demands. But the call to modern Indian sexuality was also a subject of debate. So once at an HIV prevention drop-in center, an encounter between Akshay, a working class Koti, and Shobana, an upwardly mobile transgender woman currently in law school, crystallized tensions about what it meant to be respectively feminine. Shobana usually wore a t-shirt and jeans and often spoke in English. Akshay always dressed in a plain pant and shirt, identified strongly as working class, and usually spoke in Kannada. As Shobana and I sat drinking tea and talking, Akshay joined us. So I'm going to just read you an excerpt from my field notes here. Akshay looks at Shobana. He says, I always tell her, if you could only wear some nice earrings and a bindi, you would look so nice. Shobana is wearing jeans and a t-shirt, no jewelry, no makeup, with her shoulder-length hair loose. This is my choice, she says. I also don't wear those things, I say. At least you're wearing a bindi and earrings and a nose ring, he says. And I hope you don't mind my saying, but you'd look even better if you wore bangles and toe rings. It's how a Bharatiya Nari should look. It looks nice. If you're always saying you're female, you should dress like it. There are a lot of ways to be a Bharatiya Nari, I say. Shobana agrees. This is also a way of being Indian, she says. But why do you have to dress like this? Akshay insists, now appealing to both of us. Don't feel bad, says Shobana after he leaves in a bit of a huff. He's just joking, I say. Shobana agrees, but adds, he's a little joking and a little serious. He comes back a little while later. You're always talking in English or Tamil, he complains to Shobana. You're so haughty, he adds. He switches to English, you bastard. He says that in English too. Shobana's aspirations for educated, middle-class, modern femininity came into conflict with Akshay's more traditional image of the working-class Bharatiya Nari with toe rings and bangles. I knew from other conversations that Akshay was critical of elite English-speaking queer activists. To him, Shobana's sexuality was not respectable and not even legible as feminine, and represented a kind of elite inauthenticity. But to her, it was crucial to her social mobility. So the office, a shared space for these kinds of conflicts, became a venue in which embodiments of respectable sexuality could be practiced, but also contested. And you can see this conversation ended in kind of an unresolved way. So Akshay stormed off, and Shobana said that she was going to bring it up in the next meeting as a conflict, and then they left it at that. So I want to end where I began, at the sex worker clinic in Nairobi, and I'm going to tell one more story. Hopefully I have time. So I met Ali Khan at the clinic on my first day of conducting interviews and had a long conversation with him and his partner, who was also a regular visitor to the clinic. He was part of the clinic's new effort to incorporate sex workers into their programs. And as I mentioned before, this program was modeled on the Indian experience and guided by two HIV experts who had previously worked in Bangalore. So in the interview, Ali Khan had told me about his life as a gay man in Nairobi, about the partner he loved, and about how important this sex worker clinic had been to his life and to his access to health services. After that first meeting, Ali Khan and I had been texting, and he asked if I wanted him to show me around the city. So I said yes. I met him downtown, and he arrived in a neat white short-sleeved button-down shirt, black business pants, and carrying a file folder. We spent the day walking around the city. We took pictures outside the Kenyatta International Convention Center, actually formal pictures taken by a photographer. He showed me where rallies of sex workers had taken place in the city, clubs where sex workers had hung out. This was kind of my early time in Nairobi, and hotels where he'd gone with different clients. We also visited gay and lesbian organizations funded by an array of different global donors, USAID, the Ford Foundation, and the Global Fund. We found our way into one of the offices and sat hanging out at one of the computers. Most of the most common searches on the computer were for Planet Romeo and porn, but Ali Khan opened up Facebook, and then we both looked at each other's profiles and looked through each other's family photos, watched YouTube clips of Bollywood movies, both kind of sat for 15 minutes softly singing along to Kuch Kuch Hota Hai. And then we went out for fried chicken and bhajia. Me, I don't like fucking, Ali Khan said while we were sitting at the restaurant. I like to spend time and to tell stories. I like all of that. He also told me he had a girlfriend. I love her too, he said. I didn't tell you that before. By the way, he said later, I'm planning to get married in the next 5 years, but not someone from here, from Mumbai. I'm surprised by this, but I was surprised by this, but I tried not to show it. Why Indian, I asked. I like the culture, he said. I don't mean to convey with this story that Ali Khan had bought into the claim of Indian sexual freedom and modernity, or India's advanced capacity on the global stage that I've referred to in this talk as central to the politics of AIDS in India. As I show in my book, many of the people I interviewed in India and Kenya actually contested the idea of India's relevance to Kenyan HIV programs, the idea of India as an AIDS success story, and were skeptical of attempts to follow in India's footsteps instead of building on the history of struggle closer to home. But what I want to emphasize in telling this story is that within this complex of LGBT organizations and donors, of HIV tests and surveys that demanded of Ali Khan a certain form of legible sexual identity as a gay man and sex worker who was at risk of HIV, Ali Khan was mobilizing something different. He was navigating the terrain of global public health while pursuing dreams and desires that didn't fit neatly into the sexual categorization that organizational boundaries placed on him. And it was articulating a connection to India that existed entirely outside of the Indian-led HIV prevention program in Nairobi that he was part of, and that had brought me to his clinic and had introduced us to each other. So on its own, did this constitute dissent? I want to suggest it was part of a continuum of interlinked ways in which the targets of HIV prevention reformulated their relationships to the state and to each other in the shadow of crisis. Like Preeti, Pallavi, Akshay, and Shobana in Bangalore, like the generation of activists before them who challenged the violent repression of the AIDS response, Ali Khan was living and exceeding the terms of respectable citizenship demanded by the AIDS crisis on those who put the nation at risk. So I'll stop there. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Gowri, for that wonderful talk. We'll go back to, Nelson will turn off the spotlight, so we go back to viewing everyone. If I could just ask all of you to, if you feel comfortable, to show yourselves before we turn to question and answer. And I think we're a relatively intimate group, so if you have a question, DM me, because we're intimate, but still two screens, so I may not catch your hand raise. Some of you have already messaged me, and I'll put you in the queue. So let me start with asking Bhishnupriya Ghosh, who is also obviously someone who is thought. Bishnu, perhaps you could start us off with the question, and then I will. I'll turn to the other people in my queue. I have a question too, but I'm going to cede to Bishnu first. Bishnu, please.
Yeah, thank you, Gowri, for this amazing presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book. And for the long research with these communities, having done some of it myself, I know it's not easily done. And it's many long years of trust that you have to build to do that. My question is, they're not unrelated, but I have a couple of questions. In my work in Manipur and Mumbai, I found that one of the forums where this articulation that you're trying to complicate in all these ways is the conference, the conference as a sort of the space of global civil society, so to speak. And I was talking with some of the activists who were always organized in their, sanghs, they were organized in their own community-based organizations, but they actually adopted what in biomedical discourse is called a mesoscale literacy when they go to the Durban International Conference, etc. And that's a different kind of making of a global citizen that seems to almost trump the national in some ways and gives them another legitimacy. So I was thinking about conferences and the activists that you interviewed, because HIV/AIDS is so different all over India. It's hard to even talk about it together. Whether that was something you came up on. And the second is, I think, what I found, at least in the 2000s, is all the community organizations that I interviewed turned around non-adherence. So it was not HIV/AIDS prevention, but really lost to follow, like keeping people on their meds. So that some of that respectability that you're arguing is around medical expertise, medical lingo, articulating with hospitals, and they get in bed with the state because they get free drugs. The antiretrovirals are absolutely key, right? So there are all kinds of, so I'm just wondering about those two sort of vectors in this very complicated and rich story that you've told us.
Thank you, Bishnu. Gowri, go for it.
Okay, great. Bishnu, thank you so much for that question. It's so generous, and it's really wonderful to be in conversation with you, having learned from your work as well. Yeah, I'll try to address this question of the conference first. So yeah, I think the conference is a really interesting place to look at kind of some of the moving across scales of activism that takes place. And when I was first starting my fieldwork, I went to probably the biggest conference I went to during my fieldwork was this one that I went to right at the beginning, which was the Sex Workers Freedom Festival. And it was a part of the International AIDS Conference. It was like a offshoot of the International AIDS Conference. And that conference was really interesting in part because it was part of the International AIDS Conference. There were these kind of big, like, I guess Skype was the mode at that time. So there were these like big Skype calls on a big screen with the International AIDS Conference that was going on in DC. But my observation was that most of the time those conversations that were going on with DC were not at the forefront of anybody else's mind. So the Indian activists who were there were much more interested in kind of just talking about really kind of internal conflicts, right? So, you know, and sometimes these played out in sort of regional rivalries or differences. There's so much kind of difference of opinion and strategy within the sex worker movement in India. And so all of these debates were being hashed out, and usually I would notice like all of the European delegates like crowded around these big Skype screens, and then everybody else kind of having their other conversations in the rest of the conference center. So I think that they're interesting places to observe sort of where the intersection with the global happens and ways in which it doesn't happen. And so, yeah, and I think that what you were calling mesoscale literacy, like we see it when people, you know, go to the stage and speak in a certain kind of vocabulary and then sort of switch to a different one when they move off of it. But, you know, in my research in Bangalore, I also observed a lot of other types of conference type spaces or events where conversations, panel discussions that weren't even part of the public health establishment. So like civil society meetings, places where street theater was going on, kind of all these other public engagements that were happening, where I think the mode of engagement was different, and kind of the demands placed on vocabularies and modalities were different. So yeah, I do think it's kind of it's an interesting mode because it sort of has these certain rules and boundaries around it, but then also people exceed it in all these interesting ways. Yeah, and on the non-adherence and keeping people on drugs, yeah, I actually think there's a lot of similarity actually between sort of being a good person with HIV and being like adherent to drugs. And I know people like Vin Kim Wen have written about this, or Jao Biel in Brazil, kind of talking about this like therapeutic modality of being a good citizen who's deserving of drugs. And yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels to that. So in the spaces I was working in, the focus was HIV prevention. A lot of the people I was with most of the time didn't have HIV, but were marked as at risk of HIV. But I think as you say, there are convergences in the kinds of like state engagements and expectations that come out of that. So thanks for that connection.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gowri. We have a few people, but I'm going to exercise my privilege as a moderator and ask you a question. I've had the privilege of reading this book, and so my question is drawn from something you said in this talk, and also from having, you know, read your wonderful book. And the question is about a phrase you used in this talk, symbolic geographies, right? To talk about both the scale of the region and the global, right? So of course, I have a ton of questions on Karnataka, but I'll leave those aside. But that was obviously something that you wanted to address. So my question is this. I understand the critique, or rather the analysis you're making about the kind of instrumentalization of Africa, the idea of Africa, and specifically Kenya, right, as this sort of alterity, the other side of the success story of Indian AIDS, etc. But I also wanted to hear more about how that story translates both within the collectivities you're working with. Is that kind of story or the mythology about Africa sustained or underdone? Or because, for example, I would say, for example, in a place like Maharashtra or Goa, the kinds of racisms around sort of differently racialized bodies are most virulent in lower caste communities, right? So I wanted to hear a little bit about, I hear the critique of the state form and the institutional form and AIDS form, AIDS meaning AIDS organizations, but how does this symbolic geography break down or sustain within? And then the second question, which is related to that, is in your book in India and Africa chapter, which I enjoyed reading enormously, you make an important, and Vishnu, this connects to your question about the conference, is you make a really great argument about, we get all worked up about South-South bonding, right? That we love to talk about the fact that Indians are talking to Kenyans and then there will be joy. But I think part of the point you make is that we have to understand those conversations in a long history of extractive capitalism, from colonialism to neoliberalism, right? So I see these connections on both outside of India and within. And so I wanted to hear about that, because I felt like we heard about how those places were being instrumentalized from outside, but I wanted to hear more about the inside, because that's where caste and class become. I know it's a huge question, so answer whatever you fancy, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Anjali. I think you're pointing to something that is actually kind of a bit of a disconnect, I think, in my book, which is that I talk about these symbolic geographies when I talk about the state, and then when I talk about kind of my ethnographic work in Bangalore, those engagements are backdrop, but they're not kind of the main currency through which people are interacting with each other. And I think that's a product of the fieldwork, right? So, I mean, part of it is, unless I asked, nobody was talking about Africa in my everyday conversations. But that being said, when it did come up, I think what you said about racism is apt. So, and I was around when, for example, like these African delegations, like I was around when there was a group of Nigerian diplomats who came to visit some of the organizations in Bangalore, and just learned from watching people giggling in the corner, pointing. I also sometimes, I usually asked people in my interviews whether they had interacted with people from other countries through being part of HIV prevention programs. And a couple of times when I was doing interviews in red light districts or with sex workers, kind of in the context of talking about sex work, they would kind of interpret it in that way. So they would say, oh no, we don't sleep with African clients, like we don't have sex with Black men. And so there were these kind of racist boundaries being drawn in these everyday spaces. The other thing that sometimes came up though was this kind of this investment in kind of Indian tolerance. So, and I think I do mention this conversation in the book. There's someone who I asked this question to and said, yeah, we had like a meeting with some people who were visiting from Kenya, and they they have it really bad there, and people like get killed for their sexuality there, and it just made me really proud to be Indian. And it was interesting because like I'd never heard him talk about being Indian before, right? The nation wasn't kind of the primary logic for his identity, except in that moment where we started talking about this conversation with this Kenyan group. So yeah, and I occasionally also saw, and I don't want to discount them and sort of totally let go of that, the sort of vision of third world solidarity, because there were moments where people said things like, it was really interesting to learn that, there are so many similarities between us and things like that. So those are moments where people engage those kinds of connections. And in Kenya too, when I talk to people, and in Kenya, my interviews were more focused on connections with India. There was a similar kind of ambivalence, right? So there were some people I talk about in the book who were very invested in an idea of like in rejecting the idea that Indian expertise was at all relevant, and they were basically like, why should we be learning from these people? And I talked to one NGO director who said, well, why should we be learning from sex workers in India? They can't even speak English and we do, so why do we need to talk to them? I think it was also coming out of the fact that that they had been doing work in Kenya for way longer than some of these Indian sex worker organizations had been around. And so there was a rejection, and sometimes there was also kind of a connection. So moments where activists used connections to organizations in India to advance their own case with the state, because the National AIDS Control Council in Kenya was actually very interested in adopting Indian modalities. So if they referred to Indian practice when negotiating with the state, they were able to make inroads in a way they hadn't been able to before. So they were able to leverage that to their advantage in some ways. So yeah, I mean, I think I am working to kind of position this within, as you said, kind of an increasingly kind of Indian capital investments in Kenya, kind of India's imperial ambitions in Africa are also the backdrop to this, especially kind of Modi's efforts in recent years. Yeah, I mean, I also see these as moments like where activists are inadvertently able to build connections with each other. I see that playing out too. But I think, these are the kinds of things I think in the practice of fieldwork, they required really specific attention because they aren't kind of at the forefront of people's descriptions of their lives, even if they are kind of baked into the kind of formation of the institutions they're part of.
That's really helpful for me, because I see this invocation of where things are worse, even in lower caste activist forms. And where things are worse is, oddly enough, never within India, but always outside. So the other thing I would just say is that in your book, and even in your cover, another symbolic geography are buildings. You reference in this talk offices, lodges, and then the cover of your book is the space is the character, right? The city, it's an image of. So it's something to think about. I had not thought about it that way, but every single anecdote you talked about had a building or room or an institution at the heart of it. But that was terrific. Thank you. Nidhi is next. Nidhi Mahajan.
Thank you so much, Gowri, for this really incredible talk. It's really also wonderful to see you here. I guess some of my question is linked to these India-Africa connections. And I was just wondering, sort of, given the ways in which collectives were thinking about it or not thinking about it in the variegated ways that you just talked about, what prompted this methodology in terms of thinking through India and Africa? Did it come from reading, about Africa as the other, or was there a different, I'm curious about, your personal kind of investment in that symbolic geography, actually. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's such a great question. And it's wonderful to hear, first of all, to see you and also hear it from you, because I know you're also kind of thinking about these geographies. So yeah, so I talk about this kind of in the beginning of the book. So my first time kind of studying anything related to HIV was in South Africa. And so when I first started this project, I had actually planned to and gotten funding to study, to do a comparative study of AIDS politics in India and South Africa. And that was kind of how I started the project. And I went to South Africa first. And I went back to this organization that I had worked with years before, and started just talking to them generally about AIDS activism and sex work. And then they said, it was kind of like a similar story actually to the one that I started this talk with. So they said they had just started this new research project, and it was a collaboration with an organization in Karnataka. And I was just like completely shocked by that, because I had no idea that, they had any connection to India. Like they definitely hadn't when I had been there years before. And they said, we're doing this like learning exchange with this organization because they are so advanced in their knowledge of sex workers. And so I started to kind of think of my project a little bit differently at that point, because it became clear that, what was happening was not so much what I needed to do was not so much this kind of, traditional sociological comparison, and sociologists love to do these kind of comparisons of two different countries and look at the varying trajectories of politics, which is really what I had planned. But what was emerging was kind of much more of this relational geography, where there was an idea of India as advanced, as a place to be learned from. There was an exchange of knowledges. And so I actually, went to India to do my fieldwork after that. And that was where I spent kind of the next year. And until then, I was still planning to kind of go back to South Africa at the end of it. And I ended up deciding to go to Kenya, mainly because there was a connection that was a little more direct, like because I actually had talked to these HIV experts who had been in Bangalore, who had moved to Nairobi, and who were actively like reproducing this program model in Kenya. And so that was kind of like my pathway. It actually started in South Africa and then found its way to India and then found its way back to Kenya. So I think I was following the connections kind of as they emerged to me in the process of fieldwork. And I think that's something I also try to talk about a little bit in the book, that I think, if the process of doing global ethnography does require that kind of openness and kind of letting the fields define themselves and those sites kind of define themselves, because I came in with one idea and then it kind of quickly fell apart. But I, in the process of fieldwork, these things kind of became clearer to me. So yeah, and I mean, I guess the other part of it, of course, was my fieldwork process in Kenya was very different from my fieldwork in India, partly because my project was primarily about India. So I spent more time there. And when I was in Kenya, I was mainly trying to understand kind of the extension of Indian programs in Kenya, but also because of my own kind of positionality in the two places. So I was definitely more seen as this kind of part of this global health juggernaut in Kenya. And in India, over time and a lot of work, as Vishnu was pointing out, I was able to kind of blend in a lot more, and because of language skills as well, and other just connections and sort of local experience that I had, it really helped me to do a different kind of fieldwork. So yeah, so I think that's also part of it. And I think it sort of comes through in the kind of ways that I was asked to engage during my fieldwork. And if I had more time or could kind of write another book, that's what the next book would be. That it would be like extending on that piece that I did in Kenya. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Nidhi, yeah. I think that's actually super helpful. Before we have time for one more question, if you're okay, Gowri. I think your question, Nidhi, was really useful for all of us as well, because the sightlines for the global are constantly shifting, and the reference for global or racial capitalism are also constantly shifting within all of these forms. So I think these are good, important reminders for all of us to not think about them in settled habits of reading or geopolitics, right? So I'm grateful for your thoughtful response to Nidhi's question. The last question is from Bala, who's a wonderful graduate student at UC Santa Cruz. Bala, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Gowri. It was lovely listening to your talk. I had two small questions. One was about the language mobility that you had access to comparatively in Kenya when you were working in Kenya and in Karnataka. That was a question about what do you think you had more access to, or you kind of lost access on in these two spaces? Because like what you just said about your global scholar juggernaut in Kenya, and then blend in as someone from there, because from your conversations that you spoke of, that you can, I guess you could understand what people were speaking in those rooms in India when you spoke about how they were communicating with each other. That was one. The second part of the second was about you showed the ads on the AIDS awareness programs. I was just wondering if there was any kind of performative movements for this. For example, I have known some of the people from the Jogapa and Jogati communities who have worked in some form for AIDS awareness. So did their performance in some way also feed into AIDS awareness programs? I'm not aware of that, but is that something part of your research, the Jogapa, Jogati and Jogama communities? Yeah, Thanks.
Yeah, thank
Lovely.
you so much.
I'm excited to read your book. That's really good.
Thank you so much. Yeah, these are great questions. Yeah, I think that the language mobility one is really important. I think, it is a limitation of my fieldwork, I would say, or I always thought of it as one, at least, that, because I didn't have the same language skills in Kenya, I didn't have as much access to kind of the informal conversations that were going on around me. I was able to spend time with people, outside of HIV prevention offices and have connections with people and kind of talk to them in English, but that meant I had access to the people who spoke English comfortably. And those were the people who, also were comfortable having a friendship with me. So yeah, so absolutely. I think that's part of what was different about my field work, in addition to how people perceived me, also kind of like what I was able to understand of what was going on around me. Yeah, and in some cases I would sort of have translators kind of drawn from the people around me or like people I knew. But in other cases I was kind of more, my fieldwork was also more focused on kind of interviews with NGO directors, and kind of health experts and stuff who those conversations were always in English. Yeah, so the character of fieldwork was different, but I imagine if I had different language skills, I probably would have formulated the fieldwork differently. Yeah, the other question about Jogapa and Jogti communities, a couple of the organizations I spent time in during my fieldwork have done a lot of work with these communities. There's a geography to this, as you probably know. So since my fieldwork was in Bangalore, it wasn't as prominent, but I did visit some organizations in kind of like northern Karnataka, where the whole framework was different, because there was kind of Jogti communities were like central to what was to what was happening and sort of how people found their way into HIV prevention spaces. So yeah, and if you want to talk more about that, I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Yeah. Because there's because of the performative side of it and awareness programs, because they already have like a traditional performance.
Yeah, that's right. And I think yeah, and recently I've noticed, and this is kind of more after fieldwork, but yeah, some kind of interesting intersections of kind of like activism and performance of Jogti communities and Jogapa communities. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Gowri, for your generous and thoughtful responses to our many, many questions, and for your wonderful talk. I hope people will read it. I also want to say that if you are interested in talks that we have hosted before, the recordings are all online, and we have many of the speakers here today. And I urge you, because you all have so much time and vacation is looming, that you want to spend your time listening to these very erudite people. Before I let you go, I want you to sort of also give a big shout out to everyone who's helped us get through this year. I know everyone's exhausted, but onwards and forwards. And also please register for our next event with the dashing Professor Bishnupriya Ghosh, who will be continuing some of these same conversations, and we scheduled it accordingly. So I look forward to seeing many of you back in the new year. Be safe, Jai Bhim, and towards Dissent. Thank you.
Thank you.